Yo, what's going on, guys? Rhys here from Stoic Pool with the long-awaited part 2 of the Marlowe smart contracts. You guys have been harassing me about doing one of these videos on YouTube, and so we're doing it right now. Let's get into it. Right, guys, so I recorded this yesterday, and whilst I was editing the video, like after I'd recorded it, I realized that I'd actually left a fatal little flaw in there which would allow someone to exploit the contract. So I basically had to scrap it, and I'm re-recording it today. This time I've already corrected the error. I'm going to explain what it is when I did it so you guys understand as well, so I can show you what the issue was and then how I fixed it. This is going to be quite a long video because there's a lot to cover, but I'm literally going to start. I've taken a lot of your advice on board, a lot of your feedback, because last time I did this, I'm just going to tilt that up a little bit so you can see me a bit better. There we go. So the last one I did, I was recording on my phone. Now I've got a nice sexy camera. I've got a full-on setup with OBS so I can flick in between the screens, which for me, that'll make editing the video easier, not affecting you. But what it does mean is that I've set up a couple of little screens, so I'm not going to take up too much of the screen. In the last video, I was kind of popping around all over the place so that you could see what was going on. But that isn't really necessary, so I've got this one where we can just look purely at the contract, or when I'm doing the simulation. Don't worry if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll get onto that in a second. So yeah, so these are our little scenes. Yeah, so that's it. Oh, that reminds me. So a lot of you guys were saying that because I've got like a big screen, like a 4K screen, so you guys couldn't see what was going on. So I'm literally, because I'm gonna zoom right in. So hopefully now we're in a position where you guys can see what's going on. You can see what all these little things are. You can see what I'm writing, and that will make the whole experience a lot better. Cool. So we're literally going to dive straight in. I've got this here. So what I've done, if it'll load up. So what I have here is, this is the previous contract. I was initially going to do something different, but I couldn't. There are limitations basically to Marlowe that meant I couldn't do what I wanted to do for the next contract. So this is what I've come up with. I'm just going to get rid of all of this because this is from when I was doing it yesterday. So I'm going to explain everything. Always draft the contract first so you know what elements you need to do. If you just try and build a contract on the fly, you're going to end up with little holes in it. You're going to end up not having the full process in, and you're going to kind of get lost when you're putting this thing together, unless you're particularly experienced with it, in which case I would still recommend drafting it just so you can get all the potential options out onto paper so that you know what elements you have to build, because it's still very easy, especially when things get complex, and this is going to get very complex, especially compared to the previous contract. So it's a much better process just to draft everything up first, so that you have a complete understanding of what you're doing, and then you're not wasting time or trying to think about what's happening or just generally confusing yourself, because it's incredibly frustrating losing yourself in the contract, which is probably going to happen once or twice while we do this. So apologies for that in advance. So what we've got is we've got a rental agreement, and what the contract is basically going to do is it's going to control the security deposit for the tenancy agreement. Okay, so we've got one tenant who we're going to call James, our mate James, just so we know who we're talking about and kind of put a name to the contract. And we have a landlord. The landlord's name doesn't matter, and basically anything I came up with either sounded sexist or racist or so we're just going to go with landlord because I couldn't come up with anything that was feasible. And also it can be confusing. Understanding the landlord's position is cool, but the tenant, we can just give him a name. It's a bit more fun. My mate James, your mate James, our mate James. So the start of the contract, so initializing the contract, is basically done by a holding fee. So this is a normal thing that happens in the UK, and it basically, and probably everywhere else as well, I don't understand why it wouldn't. And what you do is you pay a small deposit. It's usually the first week's rent or something. But what that does is it takes the property off the market. So then you basically give the landlord chance to check the contract, do all the security checks and the credit checks with the tenant before the tenant then pays the rest of the deposit. We're going to have all our currency in ADA. We could potentially do like AGUSD or like a different currency even now that we've done the Merry Hardfork, which is going to be implemented in just a couple of days at the end of this epoch, guys. Super excited for that. But yeah, so it's going to be 1,000 ADA. Nice, easy number to work with. 100 ADA initial holding deposit, or the holding fee, and then the 900 ADA as the rest of the deposit after the landlord's done his security checks. Okay, so this is like one section. This is another section, like initializing the contract. And then I was initially going to do this as 6 months and with 6 slots, but the contracts, it's hard to define the contracts. Like you can't, it's difficult to put like wait 6 slots in the contract. So we're not going to worry about that. What we're going to do is just have a get out clause. Okay, so what we do is we give James, our mate James, the tenant, the opportunity to break the contract early if for whatever circumstances he needs to move out. Okay, this is like a normal thing. Danny and I have it in our contract. We have it after a 6-month period, which is kind of normal. You can generally get these things put on your tenancy agreements. If you're renting and you never thought to do that, it might be a good thing to explore. Yeah, it's not guaranteed though. But I want to build this into the contract so James has the opportunity to break the contract early if circumstances mean that he needs to. And what that's going to do is it's going to initialize the end of the contract straight away. And what happens at the end of the contract or at the end of the tenancy, the landlord comes around and he has an inspection and he has a little look around and he either goes, all good, property's not damaged and the tenant gets his deposit back, or he goes, nah mate, naughty boys, you've been partying too much in my flat and you've ruined the place, in which case the tenant will lose his deposit because the landlord will take that for repairs. Now they might do like a 50-50 or they might do just like costs of repairs, but for the sake of this contract, just to keep it relatively simple, we're going to have the fixed total deposit loss, and that's the cost of partying too much in your flat and not looking after someone else's property. Then, so that is one whole section based on this trigger. This is a whole section. This is the initial trigger. And then we have, if he doesn't break, then the contract will just expire. And that's going to be, it's going to be a 12 slot wait because we're going to have the 12 months as a thing. But we can't initialize something on like wait 12 months or wait 6 months. But what we can do is we can say, if James wants to break the contract, then this happens. If not, give the contract the time to expire, which is 12 slots or 12 months, or we'll just use 12 slots. Sorry, I need to write this down just so I don't forget. 12 slots in the thing for the contract, and they're in the actual contract, sorry. And then the landlord inspection, he goes, all good, tenant's reimbursed, or he goes, nah mate, you've been raving and you've been damaging my flat, so you're losing your deposit. Okay, so that is the same as what happens here. So there's a duplicate of an option here, and it's just based on whether James wants to get out early or he doesn't, and that's essentially just a duplicate of the same options. So I hope that makes sense. I might not be explaining that too well, but you'll see what I mean when it comes to actually building the contract. Okay, and then the last thing is we need James to be protected. So this actually belongs up here. All right, but we're putting it at the end because that's where it's going to be when you build it out in the contract, because everything works in like vertical brackets, if you like. So there's this thing that happens, but it happens within the bounds of this, which happens within the bounds of this, which happens within the bounds of this. Okay, and that's going to make more sense again when we're building the contract. But James basically needs to be able to get his fee back if the landlord doesn't want him in the flat, which he's entitled to do, obviously. And that's not the exploit opportunity, but that is an exploit opportunity. This isn't the mistake I made, but this is an exploit opportunity where the landlord can basically deny any potential tenants and just keep collecting the 100 ADA holding fee every time. And obviously we don't want that to happen. So we have this part of the contract to protect James as the tenant and any other tenants, not just our mate, but any other tenants as well. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to highlight these green just like I was doing before as we go through, so we can kind of keep track of what we've made and what we need to build still. And otherwise, we're going to go straight to the Marlowe Playground, which is alpha.marlowe.iohkdev.io/ That's it. Go there. That's the Marlowe Playground. I'm going to link to it below. Okay, I'm not expecting you to write that down as I say it. Obviously, it's just for funsies. Okay, cool. So we've got our contract here. Hopefully this is clear enough for you. I'm not going to know. I'm just going to assume that it is. I've zoomed in 200%. So this is basically an HD size because I'm 4K. Cool. So the first thing we're going to do then is we basically we need to have the initialization, like what starts the contract. And the contract starts here with the holding fee. Yeah, so this thing happens. So what we need is we need to go, there's a deposit. And the deposit, it basically, when the deposit happens, so when deposit, yeah, you see how that works. When deposit, then that's the start of the contract. Okay, when actions happen like this, so this action section, I'm not going to explain all these sections because I think I touched on it in the other video, but when actions need to be defined as in a period of time or something, you can't just stick them in. So they always basically get surrounded by these when brackets, which are the contracts or micro contracts within a bigger contract. Sorry if that's a little confusing. It will make more sense if you just don't worry about it and you just say that needs to happen, then it just doesn't matter. All right, you just need to have a time that an action is triggered. You can't just have triggers floating around all over the place. It needs a time, it needs a position, it needs a place in the contract. Okay, so that's basically it. So we have this and we have two parties in this contract. We have a role of our mate James and we have another role of the landlord. Okay, guys, now the last time I recorded this video last night, it was about 1 hour and 20 minutes. So I'm going to explain everything as I go, but little actions I'm doing, like duplicating stuff, moving stuff around, I'm not really going to go into too much detail about. I think I covered that a lot more in the previous video. Yeah, so like go and check that out if you're confused, or just slow this down, watch it in half time and just track my actions. Okay, so contract up there, it's when James, so when the deposit is done by James to the amount of, we're going to go for a value, and the value is a fixed number, so it's going to be a constant, and it's 100 ADA. So I need to specify that token as well, so ADA, and we're working in ADA. Yeah, so I've got to basically fill in all these things to make this a valid block. Block. I'm going to call these blocks, okay? Don't get confused between blocks on the blockchain and blocks in the contract. This is Blockly, and that's how we're building the contract, all right? I'll see you lot. Right, so into the account of the landlord, and then we continue. So this is the initialization of the contract, and remember we need our what happens if that doesn't happen. And so we're going to give him 1 month, basically, or 1 slot, and then James is going to get his money back. So we need to go deposit, oh no, we need a contract thing here where we pay. So this is the protection. Remember here I was talking about this protection. James gets his holding fee back. We need to make sure we build this straight away so that he has it. So we're going to duplicate this, payee James, and we can't put payee in there. We need to choose a payee party. Don't ask me why we need to do that, but we just do. So I guess it's for the actual coding part when it goes into Marlowe. The amount of 100 ADA. So I'm just going to duplicate these. And from the account of the landlord. Boink. And provided that happens, then that just closes the contract. So we stick a close in. All right, we got to remember there can't be any open loops in a contract. It needs to close out. It needs to have it needs to be finalized every way round that it can be, that any path that the contract can take. So any options, any choices that can be made, they have to still finish in closing out the contract, because otherwise the contract becomes void and then everyone just gets their money back. All right, which we don't want to happen, because in this case, the money's been given straight to the landlord. It's not like it is held in the contract, but it's held in the landlord's account. So it won't get sent back to James. It'll just get given to the landlord, which we don't want to happen. Remember, we've got to protect our mate, James. Okay, so we've basically got, just in doing this, we have this bit done. So that can go green. And we also have this bit done. So that can go green. Now this bottom bit, James gets his holding fee back. This is going to show up in a couple of different places in the contract. Don't worry about that right now. I'm going to explain it when it happens. All right, so now let's move on to the next bit, which is the landlord chooses whether or not he accepts this tenant. So what that means is we have a choice, because the landlord basically has to accept tenant. and it's a choice whether or not the landlord does that, and the choice has bounds, which means there are one of or two options, or there are a couple of options, and he has between 1 or 2, which is yes or no. Okay, the choice owner is the landlord, so I'm going to duplicate him and pop him in there. And each little subcontract kind of section of this, we're going to build out separately so that you can see what's going on here. Instead of just plugging it straight in here, I mean, you'd need to when it, obviously. Remember, you need to when it. But in fact, I'm just going to put that in now because there's a choice. So there's an action, so it needs to be whened. But I could just put it in here and start building out. But what happens then is it's easy to get confused because like you put that in there, there's this open loop, there's this open loop, and then there's the next open loop, and then the next one, and then there's just a bunch of sub things. So we're going to build each part of the contract separately and then put it all together at the end. Okay, it'll make a lot more sense like that. It's much easier to process each individual action that way. So accept tenant, and he's basically got a yes or no. So that is, you've got a if observation that. So that the next part of the contract is an if, and it's basically, does he accept the tenant? And then we go if yes. So we go, we define that there is an observation, and then we've got to define what the observation is. So we go, the value of the observation is equal to. So we've got 1 and 2 here. So we go value, and then we put in here what the value is. We go choice name made by the landlord. So I'm just going to duplicate that and stick that in. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure that you can actually see what's going on the screen. And then make sure the choice, accept tenant, this needs to match, by the way, guys, is equal to constant 1. So he chooses option 1 of the bounds. And that's basically going to be yes. So that way he accepts our mate James as a tenant. Okay, so that's there. So, but then we need an if he doesn't choose that as well. So if he chooses yes, then the contract's going to progress. But if he doesn't choose that, then we need a close, just like we need a close here. So here, in this close, we're going to go, does he accept the tenant? We're actually going to give him, just like we gave him here, we gave a month. I mean, this is just one slot because otherwise the contract just expires as soon as it opens. But here, we basically, James puts his deposit in, and then we need to say whether we need to give the landlord a time frame, because then if that time frame expires, then James needs to get his money back, because that's an exploit. So we just go here, pay, duplicate, because that's exactly the same as his holding deposit. Oh, and you know what I've done? I've actually done this wrong. So this doesn't go here. This just becomes a close, because James shouldn't be getting paid anything if he hasn't done the deposit yet. So that was a good mistake you all picked up on. Thanks for that, guys. Right, guys, I've got to explain all these things, because if I make one little mistake and one of you lot catches me out, that's not going to look good. Okay, so I'm glad I picked up on that before you lot did. Okay, so if the landlord accepts the tenant, if the landlord doesn't make a decision by one slot, then after slot 1, sorry, then that's it. James gets his deposit back and we're all good. All right, so that's there. But now we need to define what happens with these observations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to leave that here. And then I'm just going to slide this, because we don't need to look at those for now, because that literally goes here. And then we've got this one, okay? So we don't need to define those right now. And I don't want to be in the way. So we've got if observation is yes. So if the tenant says yes, I wonder if we can actually change that to yes. No, we can't. That would have been much easier to work with, but it's not. So what happens if he chooses yes, then the tenancy agreement starts. Yeah, so that actually starts the tenancy agreement. So we basically need James to deposit the rest of his money. So we need to go actions, deposit, and the deposit is actually the same as this. So I'm going to delete this and I'm just going to duplicate that. And in fact, because you've got to when it anyway, I'm just going to duplicate the whole thing and put it down here. I need to change these values. And so James will pay 900 ADA because it's the remainder of the deposit. If we just go back here, remember, deposit paid 900 to the landlord. And if he doesn't within slot 1, then we actually don't just close out the contract. Or we do. We do just close out the contract. So what I was going to do is put this in here, but with the landlord getting paid the 100 ADA. But the landlord's already been paid the 100 ADA. And if I think a 1 month bound for James to actually come up with the rest of the deposit is fair play. And if he doesn't, then it's his fault. And so the landlord should be able to keep that holding fee. This is the only time that the landlord should be able to keep that holding fee. Otherwise, it should always go back to James. But for that, I don't need to define that specifically because initially the money's given to the landlord anyway. So we can just close out the contract and vopila, it's all done. Okay, so that's the next bit. And that is actually going to trigger the actual tenancy. Yeah, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to mark that. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect the contract, but it does help you just to keep track of what's going on. So I'm just going to put here, I'm going to put tenancy and then be slot start, slot interval start. And this doesn't affect actually the processing of the contract, but this is just a good way to mark it through. And this is an elegant solution I came up with to a problem that I discovered later on. It might not be that elegant, but I like to think it's quite elegant. Let's get rid of that. I just got a random pop-up on my phone, on my computer. So we've got this. This is the start of the tenancy. Now, if we go back here, this is done. All right, so now that section is complete. And we've also defined that the landlord gets the money if the deposit isn't made, which is important as well. Now we need to do this. The tenancy starts, so now we need to give the get out clause option. Okay, so this is the next part we're going to build. We're going to go here, and we're going to go actions, choice name. Okay, and now the choice is actually, you know what, I'm going to delete that. I'm just going to delete it. I'm going to duplicate this previous choice. And I'm going to when duplicate it because we need the when anyway. Sorry that that's just filled up the screen like crazy. So now this is break contract. Oh no, we'll just call it terminate tenancy. No, we'll call it break contract because terminate tenancies sounds like the landlord's doing it. Break contract. So that's not the landlord, that's our mate James utilizing his get out clause. And if observation break contract by our mate James is a constant 1, so he chooses to get out of the contract, then something else needs to happen. All right. And if he doesn't, then this is going to be the 12 months, but we've already had a month. Oh no, we haven't. So we're just going to put 12 there because I thought we had a month, but this is assuming that everything passes through. So no definition of time needs to be made because we're not passing through any particular blocks. So slot interval start, 12 months or 12 slots in this case, and then this isn't going to be here. So we're going to delete that because if he doesn't do the breakout clause, then it's just going to be the end of the contract and then the tenancy thing's going to happen. Yeah, I'm just going to refer back to here. So get out clause, landlord inspection. If no get out clause, if he doesn't break, then 12 months or slots and then landlord inspection. Okay, so now this is the next part of that's just defining that so we can come to that later. Okay, so now we need to go, that's in, that's in, that's in. What we need is we need a when. We need a when because we're having a decision, so we need to put a when in, and then we go action and we go choice name. So what, okay, so we've just had the break contract, so that bit's done. Yeah, I don't know why I right click. That section's complete. So now we need to do like what happens if he does actually do that. So what is executed by here? And the choice name again needs bounds. Oh, but we've got one that's by the landlord, which is what we need, which is up here. So I'm just going to copy this, duplicate. I should have just duplicated the whole thing, but I'm just a moose, and so I didn't. So we need choice bounds, and the bounds are 1 and 2. Like this is the property inspection. And I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to put that here. Okay, and I'm just going to refer back here. So this is landlord inspection, all good, tenant reimbursed. Now mate, tenant loses his deposit. So we go property inspection by the landlord. We need to duplicate that and put that in here. So we identify who the choice owner is. And we're just going to assume that this constant means that he chooses that things are all good. That like the property's cool, in which case James will get his deposit back. James will be reimbursed. Okay, so we're just going to identify that. And for that, we've already got a point. We've already made a block where James gets paid. So we can go and grab that. It's up here, duplicate. And then we can put it in here, and we just need to change the values so that James gets paid the right amount of money, which will be 1,000 ADA, okay, because this is to terminate the tenancy. He gets his full deposit back, and which then closes out the contract, okay? And if not, like if he doesn't choose that, then that means James, our tenant, has been a naughty boy. He's been raving up in his flat. He's damaged. He's kicked through the wall. Some of his mates broke some of the lights and the dishwasher's estate. So he doesn't get his money back, in which case it just closes out the contract without paying James back. So the landlord will take that money. Okay? And what we're going to do is, just like before, we gave a limit on time for the property inspection to happen, or for the landlord to make a decision up here. So we had, is he going to accept the tenant? We'll give him one slot, like we'll give him the opportunity to do this, and if not, then he's missed out. He's missed out his opportunity, and we can only assume that the property is all right. So we need to have the landlord accountable to actually do that, because otherwise James is trying to get out of the contract. He's allowed to do so, and the landlord is holding him up, so he's preventing that. So what we need to do is duplicate that, and we just assume if it's been a month, if it's been after the second slot, if the landlord hasn't come back, like he hasn't made one of these decisions, he hasn't done his property inspection, then James automatically gets his money back, and he can move on with the rest of his life, and he can carry on with his work, because James is a busy geezer. You know, he's got stuff to do. He's got to move house. So we need to define that is possible as well. Okay, and yeah, so that's that part. Now that's completely covered, isn't it? Perfect. So we've got a property inspection happening, which also needs to be, so that's this section done. This landlord inspection, and we need, oh, why did I go there? I need to green it. So that's done. Now we also have this section here. Yeah, so now we've built this block, we can just duplicate it and then put it in the next section where it's needed after the 12 months or 12 slots, if James doesn't choose to do the breakout clause, which we're going to assume now doesn't happen. So I can just duplicate this because it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same choices. And then this can go in here. So that's what happens if after the 12 slots or 12-month period of the contract, if James doesn't try and utilize his breakout clause, then that's automatically closed out. Mucho senso? I think so. Right, so before I do that though, what I need to do is I just need to define that that's the end of the tenancy. And again, this isn't necessary, but I'm just going to do it to identify that that's what this means. So I can go here I've got let tenancy. So this is going to be end tenancy. Okay, and this is slot interval start. This is going to be slot interval end, as in the end of the blocks, the slots. So if that time expires, then the contract is automatically finished, and it's up for renewal or up for it's basically closing out. So then I'm going to put that in, and what that does is that just helps us understand that this is the end of the contract, and it's at the end of this 12 slots, the tenancy is automatically finished, and that just means that the contract has a defined ending, because otherwise they could just continue. And again, we don't want anything to be locked up ever. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this. So instead of after slot 2, I'm going to change it to after 13, because this is slot 12. Yeah, so slot 12 is there, and then we give him the month to do his inspection. So it's going to go to 13. Hopefully that makes sense. I know I just kind of whizzed through that quite quick. So what we have here is we have when like the tenancy starts. So I'm just going to slide this here because that's where that belongs. So when the tenancy starts, we either have 12 months go by here, or we have James opts to break the contract early, in which case that happens. I know I haven't put the things in here yet, but that's because it's like the last level of the contract, and we've already got it built here. But what we want to make sure is that this is all good. So after 12 slots, the tenancy ends. Bam, 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 bam. No open loops. Everything closes out. James gets his money back. James gets his money back. And in here, James doesn't get his money back because that means he's been a naughty boy. Okay, so we're covered. that now is complete. So that whole tenancy period is complete except for this part of the contract, which is when James opts out and then the property inspection happens. So I can just put that in now. And now that holds the next section of the, like that next part is now complete. So all we've done there is from our duplicate of the property inspection, I've just put that in because that's what will happen if this choice is triggered, if James chooses to break the contract. Okay, I hope that's clear. Sorry if I'm not explaining this very well. Yeah, but I think that makes sense. I mean, we've just duplicated the thing and then put it in. Cool. So then we basically have to say, is the property damaged? Yes or no. Give him the end of slot 2 because this is slot end of slot 1 or the slot interval start for the start of the contract. So end of slot 2 to make that decision. If not, and then otherwise, so the bit missing in this contract is if observation. Yeah, so I can double check this. All right, and this is a great way of troubleshooting your smart contracts if you're building them this way, is that if a layer has a hole like this, you can just take that out, like one of the answers, and you can see both sides. So that means you can now put this whole thing in context. So the break contract, we're missing this else. So what we have is if observation 1, so that's James opting to break the contract early, then the property inspection happens and carry on. If not, then what happens? So if that doesn't happen, then we basically need to define exactly what has taken place so that we can then carry on the end of the tenancy without having any open loops. So what we need to do is go on here, contracts, and we need to assert that. Okay, and what we're basically doing here is defining the end of that contract. So we assert that, and then observation, and it's going to be the same as this, duplicate, except it's going to be choice 2 because there's only 2 options, so we can specify that that's the case, and then we know if he doesn't pick 1, then we can assume that he picks 2. We can assert that 2 is the decision that he makes, which is to stay in the tenancy, basically stay in the flat and continue with the tenancy. Yeah, and that's just to make sure that we don't have any point. This is the point where I had the exploit earlier, because before I just put a close in there yesterday, and what that means is that the landlord keeps the money and the tenancy is finished. We can't allow that to happen. Is it the tenant, is it the landlord, or our mate James who gets the money? Either way, it wasn't fair. So what we got to do is we got to define that he wait, just double check. Yeah, so what we need to do is we just need to define that he's going to continue with the rest of the contract, and in which case then the tenancy will end. Yeah, that the tenancy will end, and then we'll continue with the same answer. So basically the same thing's going to happen, like this is going to happen again, because it's just redefining this. Okay, and this doesn't necessarily need to be in the contract, but like we wouldn't necessarily have to have the back end, but because there's always 2 options, we need to define it both sides of the contract to make sure that that happens, because we can have a time where, like an amount of slots or a duration of time that the contract expires, or we have the choice of whether or not James decides to break the contract, and then we need to continue either way and make sure the contract is terminated appropriately. So here we're just going to duplicate this, the let tenancy end. So this is the second part of the contract, as if the 12 slots happen. So I'm going to put that in. I'm going to right click and duplicate it, and I'm going to put that straight into assert that choice 2 has been made, and then continue. So what we know, we already had that closed out. We know that was right because we double checked everything. And now what we've done is we've just put it in as option 2. We've asserted that he makes choice 2 to stay in the tenancy, and so that can happen, and then the contract can just expire. Like the duration of time can pass, and the tenancy agreement can expire, not the contract. Sorry, I'm using those interchangeably, and I'm sorry about that because that might be confusing. So then the property inspection happens. Is the property cool? Is it not? And then we define what happens, which we've already done, so we don't need to worry about that. But we need to define just that we're letting the tenancy end, so we can explain, if you're just looking at the contract, what is going on throughout any part of it. Okay, so now we can just stick that when in, because we've already done that as well. That means James gets it. That means he doesn't. After 2 slots, that means James gets it. That means he doesn't. And so now I'm going to zoom out because we've only looked at this in very, very small parts. But I'm going to zoom right out here and we're going to actually see what this contract looks like, because I know there are only 2 or 3 options, but there's a lot that's actually happening in this contract. So what I've got here is, you can see how many things are actually put into making, and this is quite simple. Yeah, it's not like I've built all these guys, so I'm just going to agree in that. It's not like this is overly complicated. That you can make this much more complex, but what you need to understand is the contract in Blockly or in Marlowe is going to look a lot more complex. There's going to be a lot more moving parts because you need to define exactly what happens and what the follow-on thing, like what the procedure is and what choices and observations have to be made based on every little decision. So it's not just this goes to this, goes to this, or this. It goes this goes to this, goes this, this goes to this, goes this, this is this to this, and then it ends up being like a tree of different choices, like a logic tree, or like some kind of flow thing. So what we have here, like this section, this massive section, is basically just the tenancy. So that is from here. Yeah, that's what we have just in this let tenancy. Okay, and that's half the reason why I marked that, just so that we can visualize what's going on here. I'm going to zoom back in now so we can see what's happening. So what I need to do now is just put the tenancy in here, because when James, actually I'm going to do it backwards so you can see what's going on, because that way, not backwards, but the right forwards, so you can see what's going on and it'll make more sense. So I can scroll here, contract. So I put when the deposit happens by James, which is the holding fee, to the landlord, then continue as, if not, the contract just ends. And then you go, so now we've got when the tenant, so when the landlord accepts the tenant, he either chooses or not, and if not, he has 1 month or 1 slot to do so, and then the contract ends and James gets his holding fee back. So there's no exploit there. Okay, and then we go when, then James gives him his money back, which goes there. Okay, and if he hasn't done it after 1 month, then close it. And if the landlord, here's one that we missed. If the landlord doesn't accept the tenant, which he's entitled to do, we've defined what he does if he does accept the tenant, but what does he do if he doesn't accept the tenant? If he doesn't, then James should get his holding fee back, because otherwise, remember that exploit I said about earlier, about the landlord just denying everyone and then just collecting his 100 ADA every time anyone tries to move into his flat. So we've just, all I did there was duplicate our little fail-safe here, and I duplicated it into the other part of the contract. So if the landlord doesn't accept him, then the tenant gets his 100 ADA holding fee back. Okay, cool. So that's closed. These 2 or 3 elements of the contract are now closed out. So if they don't make the main decision, then the secondary decision's made and the contract closes and finishes. Okay, and now that's everything up to the tenancy. So James does his deposit, the landlord chooses whether or not, and then James pays the rest of his deposit. And that's going to be the bit that triggers the tenancy. So now I can just slide this let tenancy part, which you're not going to see because my head's in the way. Right, so now I've just got this let tenancy part, and I can just pop that into continue as here. Yeah, so provided James gives here the rest of his deposit, his security deposit, then that can go in there. And now we now have a complete contract. So now everything's in there. I know I've just scrolled through that super fast. And this looks incredibly complicated, guys, because there's absolutely loads of stuff. Yeah, and I get that, you know, because it is complicated and there's a lot going on here. But I don't think we've made any mistakes. I might have done. And that's why we get to send this to the simulator now. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that like zoomed out like that so we kind of have a bird's eye view of it. Or it's up here, isn't it? I'm just going to leave that zoomed out. Does that work? I'm going to leave all that zoomed out so we can have like a bird's eye view of the contract, like a total view, and we're going to go and test it. So up in this top right, it says send to simulator. And when we send to simulator, I'm going to disappear because all the stuff happens on this side of the screen. And so we need to be able to see exactly what's going on, and I'm going to be in the way. So catch you in a minute. Bloop. Right, so I'm just going to, this is it in Marlowe. So this is all the contract written out in Marlowe, like coded rather than done in blocks. You don't need to worry about that right now. I'm just going to click Start Simulation up here. Start Simulation, and then we're going to go through all the steps. So James deposits his 100 ADA. Oh, if we just move to slot 1, nothing happens. Yeah, no valid inputs, transaction, they're basically the contract's closed. Assuming James, our mate James, puts his holding fee down, then it moves to the participant landlord. Does he choose to accept the tenancy? We're just going to say yes. So if he chooses the tenancy, then we've got James needs to deposit his 900 ADA. Does he do that? Yes. And now the tenancy is begun. Yeah, so now we're in within the tenancy part, so he's moved into the flat. And then he has the option to break the contract, and for this example, we're going to say that he does break the contract. And so he does break the contract, so that's choosing value 1. I wish we could use words for that, but it doesn't matter. Then the landlord, next action is the landlord choosing, doing his property inspection. So does he say that the property is all right? We're going to say yes. And so then James here, so James gets his 100 ADA, his 1,000 ADA security deposit back after moving out of the flat. Okay, now what if the landlord says no? If the landlord says no, then that means that the property's been damaged, and so the 1,000 ADA gets lost, it stays with the landlord, and James kind of pays the price of damaging the property. Okay, now what if, because we've done both options now for this part, yeah, the landlord inspection, but what happens if the landlord doesn't come around to do his inspection? James automatically gets his 1,000 ADA back because he's been given an appropriate amount of time to actually, the landlord has had an appropriate amount of time to come around and do the inspection. It's not fair for him to be holding James within the flat. He can't move out, he can't get his security deposit back. And so the deposit automatically goes back after a defined period of time. In this case, I've put 2 slots, but I could have probably put 1 because look, we've got no slots happening so far down here because it's just been choice. So there's been no period of time that's passed. So I could have just put that to 1. And in fact, I might change that. So that's all of the options now from participant landlord. So we know that part of the landlord's property inspection. So we know that part of the contract is good. Now we can go back up a level, undo a couple of times. Now what if James chooses not to break the contract? Then we move to he's in now for the appropriate amount of time of the contract. And now we have the landlord's property inspection again. Now, if he chooses that the property is all right, James gets his 1,000 ADA back. If he chooses no, then the 1,000 ADA stays with the landlord and James pays the price of damaging the property. Now, if the landlord doesn't come around and we get to slot 13, so this is the 12 months period of the contract plus the month grace period for the allowed time period for the landlord to come around and do his inspection, then James automatically gets his 1,000 ADA back. Okay, now that was the part of the contract that was an exploit earlier. Was it that bit or was it a different bit? But either way, that was automatically going to the landlord straight away, and that can't be happening because we need James the opportunity to get his money back if he's doing everything he can and the landlord's not doing his part his role, his job, you know? So then the next bit is, what if James doesn't decide? If James doesn't decide either way, we're just going to move to slot 2. Oh, but we can't because it's slot 12. So we're just going to assume that the 12 months expire, in which case landlord property inspection, obviously that comes through. Does he say, yes, the property is okay? James gets his deposit back. And if he says no, James doesn't get his deposit back and the landlord keeps the ADA because James damaged the property. Now, if the landlord doesn't come around again, he has his move to slot 13, so that's an extra slot, or in this thing is 1 month after the period of the tenancy expiring. Then James automatically gets his 1,000 ADA back, and he pays he gets refunded his money, and he's allowed to move on with his life because the landlord's had he's had an appropriate time to get his inspection done. Okay, and that's every possible route through the contract. Oh, wait, it's not. So now we're just going to do the higher level ones because what we did is we did every option of the tenancy. But what if James doesn't pay the deposit in time? The landlord keeps the 100 ADA. Okay, and this is important because if James put his money forward to hold you can still see that, can't we? Right. This is important because James has put his money forward, the landlord's done all his checks and he's accepted, but if James doesn't pay the rest of the deposit, then the landlord needs to be able to close the contract. So he's not legally bound to hold the property anymore because James hasn't fulfilled the deposit. And so the landlord needs to be able to kind of put that back on the market. Essentially here, James has wasted the landlord's time. So the landlord does deserve to keep the money, like the holding fee in this instance, because it's been an expense to him just having the property off the market. He could have potentially sold it or rented it out somewhere else. I'm going to disappear again now. So that's what happens if there's no decision made. If James doesn't pay. Now, if we go up another level, what if the landlord doesn't accept the tenant? So if the landlord doesn't accept the tenant, then James gets his 100 ADA back because the landlord said, no, we're not having you in. James should get his money back for that, I think. And if the landlord doesn't make a decision, so we move to slot 1, then again, James, after a month, James gets his ADA back because, again, now the landlord's wasting time. James deserves to have his money refunded to him for that. Okay, can we go up another level? Yeah, which is, this is the initialization of the contract. So if this doesn't happen, then we move to slot 0, and I've already done this, like nothing happens. The expiration, like the contract's just closed out. And realistically, that just means nothing happened anyway, so it kind of becomes just moot. So now we've gone through every possible outcome and every possible path through this contract. So we've covered every decision that could be made. We've covered every choice, every outcome based on every choice that could be made. And we've made sure that the appropriate action happens, or there's an appropriate close to the contract based on what happens throughout the contract. Okay, we've made it as fair as we possibly can. I think we've done a pretty good job of making it fair so that if it's the landlord's fault, James gets his money back, and if it's James's fault, then the landlord gets to keep the money, which is how everything should work. It should just be fair, shouldn't it? Well, I think we can all agree on that. So we've gone through a lot of decisions here. This is what it looks like in Marlowe. And what I'm going to do is that before we disappear, I'm going to copy all this. Copy. And it wouldn't let me save the contract yesterday. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go here. I've got tenancy deposit, like a file here. Look, 16 hours ago when I did this. Can you believe that? And I'm going to edit it because this one was the exploitable contract. So what I'm going to do is just delete all of that. And I'm going to right click and why can't I paste? There we go. So I've saved the correct contract with all the right outcomes in Marlowe on my GitHub, which I'll link to below. It's called tenancy deposit. That's what the file's called. Commit changes. So now we've got it here, and you guys, you can access this through the link in the description, and you can actually have a look at this contract, see what I've done to define everything, and kind of look at this in your own time and try and understand it. I know it's super zoomed out, so you can't see anything right now, and I'm getting text like crazy. Clients. So now you guys can go and access that. You can access the other contract as well, the initial coaching contract that I did for the first video. So both of those are going to be available to you. You can go through my access it through the GitHub account, which I'm going to put in the description below. All right, guys. So that's saved, isn't it? Cool. Back here. And I'm just going to try and save that anyway, because you never know. Edit source to go back there, guys. And I'm going to go. It says save, but then it doesn't save. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go correct. Oh, I'm going to just put security deposit. Couldn't save project. There you go. I'm not being crazy. All right, so it doesn't save for some reason. I don't know why. So I've just copied the actual Marlowe, like the actual coded contract instead of the Blockly one. I've saved it into my GitHub. Guys, there's nothing on my GitHub because I've only done it for these two contracts, so don't expect anything particularly exciting, but just so that you can access them and you can look at them in your own time if you want to have a look at it in a bit more detail and try and process everything in Marlowe, the actual programming language. All right, guys. Yeah, I mean, that's really it. Part 2 of the Marlowe contract finito. Guys, I hope this makes sense. I hope I haven't gone on too long. I mean, at the minute, it looks like it's about 45 minutes or 50 minutes of video. This is faster than the last one. Like, I must have rambled on a lot. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys. I hope this has made loads of sense to you. I'm sorry if I've run through this or anything particularly fast. Leave any questions or comments you got in the box below. I'm happy to answer your questions. This is not flawless. Marlowe is limited. There's only certain things that you can actually do with this. You can't use any oracles, so you can't really check a lot of outside data except for like 1, 2, or 3 options, like those choice bound observations. But I think you might have more flexibility and more control with what you can do in Plutus. Sorry, so I'm going to check out the Plutus Playground. And I might do a video on that coming up soon. All right. But yeah, this is Marlowe for now. I hope this makes sense. You can make contracts more complicated and more layered than this. But at first, I think you should have a look at the original video I did with a couple of different ideas, with a couple of different things, but all based on one transaction. And then you can come back to this, and this will make a lot more sense to you. It's just basically a similar kind of thing, just repeated. It's like fractalized, so stuff gets deeper. There are just more options and more layers and more subcontracts and more choices, basically, and observations made by the contract to decide what's going on and define the outcome of the contract. Check it out on the GitHub. Leave any questions or comments you got. Thanks for following us through this far. If you've got any ADA lying around, guys, consider Delegate into Stoic. That's my stake pool, Stoic. Wearing the colors today, love it. You can find out about that on stoicpool.com. You can check out the other videos on how the pool's doing on the YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe, give us a big thumbs up, share us with your mates and other ADA holders, anyone who's interested in making smart contracts, because yeah, I don't know if there's a lot more information about actually building these things on YouTube. For the amount of messages I get from you guys, I'm guessing that there isn't. I haven't really looked, to be honest with you. But we're on the brink of having these things implemented on Cardano. So learn about it, send it to developers, send it to people who are working on Solidity, and get them moved over onto a functional programming language that can be used on the Cardano blockchain. Yeah, I'm super excited about the future of Cardano, and I hope you guys are too. I can bet that's basically it, guys. Delegate to Stoic. Support the pool, earn yourself some rewards. I'll catch up with you in the next video. Keep in touch with yourselves.